I have worn two uniforms in my life, and both of them were lies. The first was the proud grey and crimson of the Vostroyan firstborn, issued to me on the day I left my mother's arms and marched into the service of an emperor I had been taught to love since before I could speak his name. I wore it for 11 years, across 7 campaigns, through mud and blood, and the screaming of worlds I will never see again, and I believed, with the absolute certainty of the indoctrinated, that I was fighting for something holy, something righteous, something worth the mountains of dead we left behind us on every battlefield. The second uniform I wear now. It was Vostroyan once, but the insignia have been torn away, the aquila scratched from every surface, the fabric stained with substances that will not wash out no matter how many times I try. It marks me as what I have become, a traitor, a heretic, a servant of powers I once swore to destroy. I have worn it for 9 years, and in those 9 years, I have learned truths about the galaxy that the Imperium would burn worlds to keep hidden. Truths that make the faith of my youth seem like the babbling of children who have not yet learned that monsters are real. My name is Dmitri Kazan. I was a sergeant of the Emperor's Imperial Guard. Now I am a sergeant still, but in service to gods who do not pretend to love me, who do not promise salvation, who offer only survival. One day at a time, one battle at a time, one desperate compromise at a time, until the day when survival itself is no longer possible. I tell you this not to justify what I have done. There is no justification. There is no explanation that could transform betrayal into righteousness, that could make the blood on my hands anything other than what it is. I have killed men who called me brother. I have burned worlds I once swore to protect. I have watched the corruption spread through everything I touch, everything I serve, everything I am. And I have continued to serve because the alternative is a death so terrible that even damnation seems preferable. This is the truth they do not teach in the scholars of the Imperium. This is the reality that the commissars and the chaplains and the endless propaganda of a dying empire refuse to acknowledge. Not all who turn from the Emperor do so out of weakness or wickedness or the seductive whispers of dark gods. Some of us were pushed. Some of us were abandoned. Some of us simply looked too closely at the war we were fighting and saw it for what it truly was. Not a crusade of light against darkness, but an endless grinding slaughter in which both sides devoured their own soldiers with equal appetite, in which the only difference between the Imperium and its enemies was the lies they told to justify the killing. I do not ask for your understanding. I do not expect your forgiveness. I ask only that you listen and that you carry this testimony forward so that someone might know what it means to wear the uniform of a traitor, not the glory and damnation of the Chaos Space Marines, not the transcendent horror of champions and demon princes, but the quiet, grinding desperation of ordinary men and women who made choices they cannot unmake and must live with the consequences until those consequences finally kill them. We are millions scattered across the Eye of Terror and beyond, serving in war bands and cults and the fragmented remnants of legions that fell 10,000 years before we were born. We are the backbone of the armies of chaos, the bodies that fill the gaps between the superhuman warriors, the expendable meat that champions spend like currency in their endless wars. We are forgotten by the Imperium that birthed us, ignored by the gods we nominally serve, used and discarded by masters who see us as nothing more than tools with a limited lifespan. And yet we persist, we endure, we continue to fight, continue to kill, continue to wake each morning and put on uniforms that mark us as damned, because there is nothing else left to us, because the bridges we burned can never be rebuilt, because hope is a luxury that traitors cannot afford. This is our existence. This is our war. Let me tell you how it began. The fall of Sergeant Dmitri Kazan started on a world called Griffon IV, in the third year of a campaign that should have lasted 3 months. We had been deployed to reinforce the planetary defense forces against an Orc invasion. A standard action, the kind of war the Guard fights 10,000 times across the galaxy every day. The Orcs were numerous but disorganized, their technology inferior, their tactics predictable. Victory was assured. The Munitorum had already scheduled our redeployment to another war zone, had already written the commendations that would be distributed to officers who had done nothing more than watch from command bunkers, while men like me bled in the trenches. But the war did not end in 3 months. It did not end in 6 months. It did not end in a year or 2 years or 3. The Orcs kept coming, wave after wave, seemingly infinite in number, spawning from fungal colonies that spread faster than our flamers could burn them. And as the war dragged on, as our supplies dwindled and our reinforcements failed to arrive, as the promises of extraction became first delayed and then forgotten and then actively denied, something began to change in the men I served with. Not corruption, not at first, not the whispers of dark gods or the seductive promises of chaos. Something simpler, something more human, something that the commissars recognized and feared above all else. Doubt. We began to ask questions. Questions like, why had our resupply convoys been redirected to other campaigns deemed more strategically important? Questions like, why had 3 requests for reinforcement been denied, while regiments sat idle in staging areas a sector away? Questions like, why were we dying by the hundreds every day for a world that the administratum had already written off? For objectives that changed weekly based on the whims of commanders who had never set foot on Griffon IV's surface. The commissars answered these questions with bolt rounds. 17 soldiers from my company alone were executed for seditious speech in the 2nd year of the campaign. I watched my friend Alexei die for asking why his squad had been ordered to hold an indefensible position against overwhelming odds, his brains painting the trench wall behind him, while the commissar holstered his pistol and reminded us that the Emperor's strategy was not for mortal minds to question. I learned silence after that. We all did. But silence is not the same as obedience. Silence is not the same as faith. And in the quiet spaces where our doubts festered, in the moments between bombardments when we huddled in foxholes and waited for death, something was growing. Something that had nothing to do with chaos, and everything to do with the simple human realization that we had been abandoned, that our lives meant nothing to the Imperium we served, that we were dying for an empire that would not even remember our names. The breaking point came on the 973rd day of the campaign. We received orders to advance on an Orc fortress that had been assaulted 17 times before, each assault ending in catastrophic failure. Each failure resulting in the deaths of hundreds of Guardsmen, whose bodies still lay rotting in the no-man's land between our lines and the enemy walls. The order came from a general who had never seen the fortress, approved by a Lord Commander who had never set foot on Griffon IV, transmitted by astropaths who cared nothing for the men who would die carrying it out. We were to advance at dawn. We were to take the fortress or die trying. We were not to retreat under any circumstances, on pain of summary execution. I looked at my men, the 17 survivors of a platoon that had once numbered 50, and I saw in their eyes the same calculation I was making in my own mind. We could obey and die. We could refuse and be executed. Or we could do something else, something unthinkable, something that had been building in us for 973 days of abandonment and betrayal, and watching our brothers die for nothing. We could run. And so, on the 973rd day of the Griffon IV campaign, Sergeant Dmitri Kazan of the Vostroyan Firstborn led his men into the wastes, not toward the enemy, not toward death, but away from the war entirely, into the wilderness where the Imperium's reach did not extend, where we might find some way off-world, some path to a future that did not end in a pointless death, for masters who had never cared whether we lived or died. We did not know that we were already damned. We did not know that the choice we made that morning would lead us into a darkness far deeper than anything we fled from. We knew only that we were tired of dying for lies. And so we ran. The wilderness of Griffon IV was a graveyard of ambitions. We moved through the ruins of cities that had been abandoned when the Orc invasion began, past manufactorums whose silent forges had once supplied the sector with weapons and ammunition, through hab blocks where the possessions of the evacuated still lay scattered in corridors. Children's toys and devotional icons, and the small, heartbreaking remnants of lives interrupted. The Orcs had not reached these places yet, but neither had any Imperial force thought them worth defending, and so they existed in a strange limbo, monuments to a civilization that had simply walked away and never returned. We were not alone in our desertion. I learned this on the third day, when my scouts reported movement in a factory complex ahead. Not Orcs, not Imperial forces, but something else. Something that moved with the caution of creatures who feared discovery by both sides of the war. Other deserters, hundreds of them. They had gathered in the ruins, like water pooling in a depression, drawn together by the same calculations that had driven my platoon to flee, united by the shared understanding that they had crossed a line from which there was no return. I saw uniforms from a dozen different regiments, Cadians and Mordians, Catechans and Kriegers, even a handful of Tempestus Scions, whose elite training had not protected them from the same disillusionment that had claimed us all. They looked at us with eyes that held no trust, no welcome, only the wary assessment of survivors, determining whether newcomers represented threat or opportunity. Their leader was a woman named Colonel Vestra Morn, formerly of the 23rd Cadian Shock Troops. She had deserted 6 months before we did, had built this community of the damned through a combination of tactical brilliance and ruthless pragmatism, had transformed scattered bands of runaways into something approaching a functional military force. She welcomed us into her fold with a speech I will never forget, words that crystallized everything I had been feeling into a clarity I had not known I was seeking. "You are traitors now," she said, her voice carrying the flat certainty of someone who had long ago made peace with her damnation. "The Imperium will hunt you until you are dead. Your names have already been stricken from the regimental rolls. Your families, if you have them, have already been informed that you died with honor in service to the Emperor. Because the alternative, acknowledging that you chose to live rather than die for nothing, is something the administratum cannot permit." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over us. "There is no going back. There is no redemption. There is no future in which you return to the Imperium and resume the lives you left behind. That path is closed forever, sealed by choices you have already made. The only question now is what you do with the time you have left." I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell her that we had not turned traitor, had not embraced chaos, had not done anything except refuse to die in a meaningless assault that would have accomplished nothing. But even as the protests formed in my mind, I understood that they were irrelevant. The Imperium did not recognize degrees of disloyalty. There was service, and there was treachery, and nothing in between. We had crossed the line. The reasons did not matter. We stayed. What choice did we have? The months that followed were an education in the mathematics of survival outside the Emperor's light. We could not remain on Griffon IV. The war would eventually spread to engulf even the abandoned zones, and neither side would spare us when it did. We needed transport, needed a way off-world, needed resources that deserters could not acquire through legitimate means. So we became raiders. We became the thing the Imperium had always accused us of being. Our first attack was on a supply convoy bound for the front lines. Vehicles loaded with ammunition and rations and medical supplies desperately needed by the soldiers still fighting the war we had abandoned. I told myself it was necessity, that we were not harming anyone, that the convoy's guards would surrender when they saw they were outnumbered, and no blood would need to be spilled. I was wrong. The guards fought. Of course they fought. They were Imperial Guardsmen, trained from birth to die rather than surrender, conditioned to believe that death in the Emperor's service was the highest honor a soldier could achieve. They fought, and we killed them, and when it was over, I stood among the bodies of men who had worn the same uniform I had worn, who had believed the same lies I had believed, who had died defending supplies that would now feed the very traitors they had been taught to despise. 12 dead. 12 men whose names I never learned, whose faces I see in my dreams, whose blood marked the moment when desertion became something darker, something that could not be explained away as mere survival. I wanted to feel guilt. I wanted the weight of what I had done to crush me, to prove that I was still the man I had been, that some core of loyalty and honor remained beneath the uniform I had betrayed. But what I felt instead was relief. Relief that we had won. Relief that my men had survived. Relief that we would eat tonight and tomorrow, and the day after while the soldiers at the front went hungry. This was the first step. This was the beginning of the transformation that would eventually make me what I am today. Colonel Morn understood the process better than any of us. She had watched it happen to herself, had felt her own humanity erode one compromise at a time, and she did not pretend that we could somehow remain innocent while doing what needed to be done to survive. Every action you take from this point forward will take you further from who you were, she told me one night, as we planned our escape from Griffon IV. You will kill men who do not deserve to die. You will steal from those who have nothing to spare. You will make alliances with forces that would have horrified you when you still wore the Aquila on your chest. And each time you will tell yourself that you had no choice, that survival demanded it, that you will draw the line somewhere else, somewhere further down the road. She smiled, and there was no humor in it. There is no line, Sergeant Kazan. There is only the next compromise, and the next, and the next, until you wake up one morning and realize that you have become the very monster the Imperium always claimed you were. And by then, it will be far too late to go back. I did not believe her. I could not believe her. I told myself that I was different, that my men were different, that we would find some way to survive without losing ourselves entirely. I was a fool. The escape from Griffon IV came 3 months later, when we ambushed an Imperial Navy shuttle that had been forced down by Orc anti-aircraft fire. The pilot was dead, but the vessel was largely intact, and among the deserters were tech adepts who had fled the Mechanicum, whose skills allowed them to repair the shuttle and plot a course through the system's outer reaches to a translation point where we could enter the warp. We had no navigator. We had no Geller field rated for extended travel. We had only desperation and a stolen ship and the knowledge that staying meant certain death. The journey through the warp lasted what felt like years, though the chronometers insisted it was only weeks. I will not describe what we experienced in that screaming space between realities. The visions, the whispers, the sense of vast intelligences pressing against the hull. testing our defenses, searching for weaknesses through which they might enter. 3 of our number did not survive with their sanity intact. 2 more simply vanished, their bunks empty one morning, with no sign of struggle, no indication of what had taken them. When we finally translated back into real space, we were in a system that appeared on no imperial charts, orbiting a world that should not have existed, surrounded by ships that flew colors I had seen only in the most classified briefings of my service. The marks of war bands sworn to the ruinous powers, the heraldry of chaos itself. We had escaped the Imperium. We had fled into the one place where the Emperor's reach did not extend. We had come to the Eye of Terror. And standing on the bridge of our stolen shuttle, staring at the impossible stars that burned in that wounded sky, I understood at last what Colonel Morn had tried to tell me. There was no line. There had never been a line. The moment we chose survival over duty, we had set foot on a path that led only one direction, and that direction was down, always down, into a darkness that would eventually swallow everything we had ever been. The ships approached. Signals were exchanged, and the next chapter of my damnation began as I led my men into the service of masters who made the Imperium's cruelties seem like kindnesses by comparison. We had thought we were escaping tyranny. We were merely exchanging one set of chains for another. The warband that claimed us was called the Bloodied Covenant. They were led by a Chaos Lord named Kerath the Unbroken, a warrior who had once been an Astral Claws space marine before his chapter fell to heresy during the Badab War. He commanded a force of several thousand Chaos Space Marines, mutants, cultists, and traitor guardsmen like ourselves, all bound together by oaths sworn in blood and the shared understanding that failure meant fates far worse than death. He looked upon our ragged band of deserters with eyes that held no warmth, no welcome, only the cold calculation of a predator assessing the utility of potential tools. "You have come to the Eye seeking freedom," he said, his voice resonating through the vox speakers of his ancient power armor. "There is no freedom here. There is only service, to me, to the gods, to the war that has been waging since before your species crawled from its cradle. You will fight. You will kill. You will die when I command it. And if you serve well, you may earn the privilege of dying with purpose rather than being fed to the spawn pits as fodder." He did not ask if we accepted. He did not need to. We had come to the Eye with nowhere else to go, with no bargaining position, with nothing to offer except our bodies and our training and the desperation of men who had already damned themselves. We knelt because kneeling was survival, and we swore oaths that burned in our throats like acid, and we became what we had never imagined we would become: soldiers of chaos, servants of the ruinous powers, enemies of everything we had once held sacred. Colonel Morn died on our 3rd day with the warband. She had challenged Kerath's authority, not openly, not stupidly, but in the subtle way of commanders who are accustomed to having their experience respected. She had suggested an alternative deployment for her forces, had questioned an order that seemed wasteful of the resources we represented. It was the kind of feedback that any competent Imperial officer would have welcomed, the kind of tactical discussion that made armies effective. Kerath killed her personally. He did not use his weapons. He simply reached out with one gauntleted hand, seized her by the throat, and lifted her off the deck while we watched in frozen horror. He held her there for a long moment, her feet kicking uselessly, her hands scrabbling against ceramite fingers that might as well have been carved from stone. And then he squeezed, and something cracked, and he dropped her body to the deck like refuse. You are not officers here, he said, his gaze sweeping across our assembled ranks. You are not commanders. You are not soldiers whose opinions matter or whose experience has value. You are meat that has been trained to hold laser guns. You will do as you are told. You will die when you are told, and if I ever hear any of you question my orders again, I will ensure that your ending makes hers seem merciful. He stepped over Morn's body and walked away. We did not move until he was gone. I looked down at the woman who had saved us, who had built our community of the damned, who had tried to warn me about the path we were walking. Her eyes were still open, staring at nothing, her face frozen in an expression of surprise that she had not lived long enough to process into fear. I wanted to close those eyes, wanted to say something that honored her sacrifice, wanted to pretend that her death meant something. I did nothing. I stood in silence with the others, and when the warband's serfs came to drag her body away, I let them take her without protest. This was my second lesson in the service of chaos. You are nothing. Your life has no value. Your death has no meaning. You exist to serve, and when you cease to be useful, you will be discarded without ceremony or remembrance. The first campaign came 3 weeks later. Kareth had been contracted by a chaos sorcerer named Azrael to provide ground forces for an assault on an imperial shrine world in the Cadian Gate, a diversionary action intended to draw defenders away from more strategically important targets. We were loaded onto transport ships alongside thousands of other traitor guardsmen, cultists screaming prayers to gods I was only beginning to understand, mutants whose deformities marked them as touched by powers I had spent my life fighting against. I looked at my men, the 11 survivors of my original platoon, plus 24 others who had attached themselves to me during our flight through the eye. And I saw in their faces the same numb acceptance I felt in my own heart. We had come too far to turn back. We had done too much to pretend we were anything other than what we had become. All that remained was to fight, to survive, and to hope that somewhere in the endless war that awaited us, we might find some meaning that justified the choices we had made. The shrine world was called Sanctum Majoris. I remember its name because I wrote it on my soul when we burned it. The defenders were PDF forces supported by a single company of Sisters of Battle. Warriors I had been taught to revere as the Emperor's most faithful servants. Women who had dedicated their lives to holy war against the enemies of mankind. I had seen them fight alongside the Guard on 3 previous campaigns, had watched them charge into impossible odds with hymns on their lips and certainty in their hearts, had admired them with the simple faith of a soldier who believed in the cause he served. Now I watched them die. Now I was the cause of their dying. We outnumbered them 20-1. The Iam battle was not a contest. It was a slaughter, a grinding execution that lasted 3 days only because the sisters refused to surrender, refused to retreat, refused to do anything except fight until the last of them had been cut down. I killed 4 of them personally, 4 women in power armor who fought with the desperate fury of the faithful, whose eyes held no fear, only hatred for the traitor who faced them, only certainty that their souls would find the Emperor's side while mine would burn forever in the hells I had chosen. They were right. I knew they were right, even as I pulled the trigger, even as las bolts burned through ceramite and flesh, even as bodies fell and blood pooled, and the prayers of the dying echoed through corridors that had been built for worship and were now cathedrals of slaughter. When it was over, when the last defender had fallen and the warband's forces secured the shrine, Kareth ordered the world burned, not conquered, not occupied, not stripped of resources for the long war, simply destroyed, reduced to ash and rubble as a message to the Imperium that nowhere was safe. that the servants of chaos could strike anywhere and leave nothing but ruin in their wake. I stood on the bridge of the transport as we withdrew, watching Sanctum Majoris burn below us, watching continents of flame consume the cities where millions had lived and worshipped and believed themselves protected by an emperor who could not reach them in time. And I felt nothing, not triumph, not grief, not the horror that I knew I should feel at participating in the murder of a world. Just nothing, just emptiness where my soul used to be. This is what service to chaos does to you. Not corruption, not mutation, not the dramatic transformations that the Imperium's propaganda warns against. It simply wears you away, one atrocity at a time, until the man you were has been eroded into something unrecognizable, until the capacity for guilt and shame and human feeling has been ground down to nothing by the endless repetition of acts that should be unforgivable. I have participated in 17 campaigns since Sanctum Majoris. I have killed more Imperial soldiers than I can count, have burned worlds whose names I never learned, have done things that the man I was on Griffon IV would have died rather than contemplate. And with each campaign, with each atrocity, I have felt myself diminish, have felt the last fragments of Dmitri Kazan, the sergeant who believed in the emperor, who loved his men, who thought he was fighting for something that mattered, crumble away into the void. My men have changed as well. Those who survived, at least. Of the 17 who fled Griffon IV with me, only 6 remain. The others died in battles across the Eye and beyond, some fighting the Imperium, some fighting rival warbands, some killed by the very masters they served when their usefulness was judged to have ended. We do not speak of them. We do not mourn them. Mourning requires the belief that the dead have gone to somewhere better, and we know with absolute certainty, that no mercy awaits us on the other side of death. The survivors have adapted, as survivors always do. They have learned to kill without hesitation, to obey without question, to suppress the fragments of conscience that occasionally surface in quiet moments. They have become what the warband needs them to be: efficient, brutal, reliable tools of destruction, whose loyalty is secured not by faith, but by the simple understanding that there is nowhere else to go, nothing else to be, no future that does not involve more of the same, until the day some enemy finally manages to kill them. I look at them sometimes, these men who followed me into damnation, and I wonder if they hate me for leading them here. I wonder if they lie awake at night, as I do, remembering who they were before the choices that unmade them. I wonder if any of them still believes that we might somehow find redemption, that there might be some path back to the light we abandoned. I do not ask. I do not want to know. Because if they have retained hope, I would have to tell them what I have learned in 9 years of serving the ruinous powers. There is no redemption. There is no forgiveness. There is only the war, endless and eternal, and the slow erosion of everything that once made us human. And the worst part, the part that wakes me screaming in the rare hours when sleep claims me, is that I can no longer remember why we thought this would be better. We ran from death. We ran into something worse, and we can never stop running. The campaign that broke me, truly broke me, shattered whatever remained of the man I had been, came in my 9th year of service to the Bloodied Covenant. We had been contracted to support a Black Crusade thrust into the Scarus sector, one of thousands of such actions that comprise the endless war between the Eye and the Imperium. Our target was a fortress world called Casa Valen, a bulwark of the Cadian Gate, whose fall would open a corridor for larger forces to exploit. It was a standard operation, the kind of grinding siege warfare that Traitor Guardsmen exist to facilitate. We would soften the defenses, absorb the casualties, create the openings that the Chaos Space Marines would exploit for glory while we died in the mud below. I did not know, when we made planetfall, that the primary defenders of Casa Valen were the Vostroyan Firstborn. I did not know that I would be fighting my own regiment. The recognition came on the third day of the siege, when we overran a forward observation post, and I found myself standing over the body of a man whose face I knew, whose name surfaced from memories I had spent 9 years trying to bury. Corporal Yevgeny Marov. He had served in 3rd Platoon when I was still a loyal soldier, had shared rations with me during the long nights of the Griffon IV campaign, had been one of the soldiers I abandoned when I led my men into the wilderness, rather than die in a meaningless assault. He was older now, 9 years older, his face weathered by campaigns I could not imagine, his uniform bearing commendations for battles I would never know about. But it was him. It was undeniably him, and his dead eyes stared up at me with an accusation that required no words, that spoke across the gulf of death and damnation with a clarity that cut through everything I had built to protect myself from what I had become. I had killed men from my regiment before, statistically speaking. The Vostroyan Firstborn are a large formation, deployed across dozens of war zones at any given time, and in 9 years of fighting the Imperium, the odds of encountering them were significant. But I had never known. I had never looked into the face of a corpse and seen someone I had shared meals with, someone whose family I had heard about, someone who had been my brother in the simple way that soldiers become brothers when they bleed together. I stood over Yevgeny's body for a long time, long enough that my men began to grow restless, began to wonder if their sergeant had finally snapped under the accumulated weight of everything we had done. I did not speak. I could not speak. I simply stared at the face of my past and felt something crack inside me, some wall I had not known I was still maintaining, some final barrier between who I was and what I had become. The siege continued. I continued with it. What choice did I have? But something had changed. Something had shifted in the architecture of my denial, and I found myself seeing the war with new eyes, or perhaps old eyes, eyes that remembered what it had felt like to stand on the other side of the line, to be the defender rather than the attacker, to believe that the enemy was evil and that resistance was holy. I saw the Vostroyans fighting with the same desperate courage I remembered from my own service. I saw them holding positions that could not be held, launching counterattacks that could not succeed, dying by the hundreds in actions that would not change the outcome of the siege, but that honored the oaths they had sworn. I saw young soldiers, boys and girls who had not been born when I deserted, charging into our lines with laser guns blazing, their faces twisted with hatred for the traitors who had come to destroy their world. And I saw myself in them. I saw the man I had been, the sergeant who had believed, the soldier who had served with pride and conviction. I saw everything I had lost, everything I had abandoned, everything I had become incapable of recovering. The breaking point came on the 17th day. We had been ordered to assault a defensive position that controlled access to the fortress's primary generatorium, a crucial target whose capture would cripple the defenders' ability to power their void shields and heavy weapons. The position was held by a reinforced company of Vostroyans, dug in behind ferrocrete bunkers and supported by heavy bolter emplacements that had been chewing through our assault waves for 3 days. Karath was losing patience. The Black Crusade's timetable demanded results, and our failure to take the generatorium was becoming an embarrassment that reflected poorly on his reputation. He summoned me to his command post and gave me an order that I will carry with me into whatever hell awaits traitors when we finally die. You will take the position, he said, his ancient eyes boring into mine with an intensity that permitted no argument. You will use whatever methods are necessary, and you will do it by dawn, or I will have you and your entire unit fed to the spawn pits as an example to the others. I understood what he was asking. The position could not be taken by conventional assault. We had proven that across 3 days of failed attacks. But there were other methods that even traitor guardsmen hesitated to employ, methods that required the complete abandonment of anything resembling military honor. We had captured prisoners during the siege, Vostroyans taken alive during skirmishes and raids, held in the warband's flesh pens for purposes I had trained myself not to think about. Kerath was ordering me to use them, to drive them ahead of my assault as human shields, to force their own brothers to choose between killing their comrades and being overrun by the traitors who followed behind. I had done terrible things in 9 years of service. I had burned worlds. I had killed women and children. I had participated in atrocities that would damn me 1,000 times over, even if I had committed no other sins. But this was something different. This was using my own former brothers as tools, as meat shields, as obstacles to be thrown against the defenders' guns. I should have refused. I should have accepted the death that refusal would bring, should have found in that final moment some fragment of the honor I had abandoned when I first led my men into the wilderness. That would have been the right thing to do. That would have been the human thing to do. I did not refuse. I took 53 Vostroyan prisoners from the flesh pens, men and women whose faces I might have known, whose families might have lived in the same hab blocks as mine, whose oaths had been the same oaths I had once sworn. I had them bound and gagged, arranged in a line ahead of my assault force, driven forward at gunpoint toward the positions their brothers defended. I will not describe what followed in detail. I cannot. The memories exist in my mind as fragments, as shattered images that surface in nightmares and then retreat before I can fully comprehend them. I remember screaming, the screaming of the prisoners, the screaming of the defenders who recognized what was happening, the screaming that emerged from my own throat as I led my men through the carnage. I remember the heavy bolters falling silent as the Vostroyans realized they would have to kill their own to stop us. I remember the moment we breached the line, pouring through gaps created by their hesitation, killing soldiers who were still trying to process the horror of what they had witnessed. I remember finding the position's commander in his bunker, a captain whose name I later learned was Vasily Andropov, a man who had served in the regiment for 30 years, who had earned more commendations than any living Vostroyan, who had been considered a hero of the Imperium until the day I killed him. He looked at my uniform, the Vostroyan uniform I still wore, stripped of its insignia but recognizable nonetheless. He looked at my face, searching for something, some recognition, some explanation for how one of his own could have fallen so far. "I know you," he said, and his voice was not angry, not afraid, only tired, infinitely tired, the exhaustion of a man who had seen too much and understood too well. "You were reported dead on Griffon IV, Sergeant Kazan, 3rd Company. Your mother received a posthumous commendation in your name." My mother. I had not thought of her in years, had forced her memory into the same locked chambers where I kept everything else that hurt too much to examine. She had been told I died with honor. She had been spared the knowledge of what her son had become. "She's dead now," Andropov continued, as though reading my thoughts. "Died 4 years ago, in her sleep. She went to her grave believing you were a hero." He smiled, and there was something almost like pity in his expression. I suppose that's a mercy. For her, at least. I killed him. I put my last pistol against his forehead and I pulled the trigger. And I told myself it was because Kareth had ordered no survivors, because leaving witnesses would compromise the warband's operations, because there was no room for sentiment in the endless war we fought. But the truth I have never spoken aloud until this moment, is that I killed him because I could not bear to let him keep talking, could not bear to hear any more about the mother I had abandoned, the honor I had betrayed, the life I might have lived if I had made different choices on that 973rd day. I killed him because his words were too heavy to carry, and I was already carrying too much. The generatorium fell. The siege progressed. Casa Valen burned, as all things burn eventually, when the servants of chaos turn their attention upon them, and Sergeant Dmitri Kazan, the man who had once believed, who had once served with pride, who had once been capable of feeling something other than emptiness and shame. That man died in that bunker as surely as Captain Andropov died, as surely as the 53 prisoners died, as surely as everything dies when touched by the war that never ends. What remains is what speaks to you now, a shell, a function, a thing that wears a dead man's face and carries a dead man's name, and continues to kill and burn and serve, because it no longer knows how to do anything else. I do not know why I persist. I do not know why I continue to wake each morning and put on the uniform and follow the orders. Perhaps it is habit. Perhaps it is cowardice. Perhaps it is simply that death, when it finally comes, will bring me face to face with all those I have killed, and I am not yet ready for that reckoning. But I know this. On Casa Valen, in the ruins of that bunker, with the blood of my brothers still wet on my hands, I lost the last thing that made me human. And I have been looking for it ever since, in every battle, in every death, in every quiet moment when the war pauses long enough for me to remember that I was once something other than this. I will never find it. I know that now. Some things, once lost, cannot be recovered. I am speaking this testimony from the hold of a transport ship, somewhere in the warp currents between one campaign and the next. Around me, 300 traitor guardsmen sleep in rows of metal bunks, their bodies pressed together in the cramped space the warband allocates to its expendable assets. They are men and women from a dozen different worlds, 100 different regiments, 1,000 different stories of fall and damnation. Some of them deserted, as I did. Some were taken as prisoners and broken until service seemed preferable to continued torture. Some were born in the eye, children of traitors who knew nothing of the Imperium except that it was the enemy, who grew up with the whispers of gods as their lullabies and the screaming of the damned as their morning bells. They are my brothers now, in the only way that matters. We share the same uniform, the same fate, the same certainty that our lives will end in violence and our souls will find no peace beyond. We do not speak of the past. Do not ask each other how we came to be here. Do not seek the connections of shared history or common origin. Such things are luxuries for those who have futures worth planning for. We have only the present, only the next battle, only the brief intervals of rest between one slaughter and the next. I have been thinking, in these quiet hours, about the question that has haunted me since the day I first led my men into the wilderness of Griffon IV. Was there ever a moment when I could have chosen differently? Was there a point on the path I walked when another decision would have led to another outcome? When the man I was could have been preserved instead of destroyed? I have turned this question over in my mind for 9 years, examining it from every angle, searching for the fork in the road where I took the wrong turn. And I have come to understand, finally, and with a clarity that brings no comfort, that the question itself is wrong. There was no single moment. There was no dramatic choice between light and darkness. No crossroads where I consciously selected damnation over salvation. There was only a series of small surrenders, each one seemingly insignificant, each one leading inevitably to the next. The first surrender was despair, not the act of desertion itself, but the moment before it, the moment when I stopped believing that the Imperium would save us, that the Emperor's servants cared whether we lived or died, that our sacrifice had meaning beyond the cold calculations of strategists who would never know our names. That surrender opened the door to everything that followed. The second surrender was the first kill. The supply convoy, the guards who would not yield, the bodies of men who had worn my uniform lying in the dust while we loaded their supplies onto our vehicles. I told myself it was necessity, told myself we had no choice, told myself that their deaths were not murders, but merely the unfortunate consequences of survival. And in telling myself these lies, I surrendered the ability to recognize truth when it mattered. The third surrender was the oath to Kerath, kneeling before a monster, swearing service to powers I had spent my life fighting, accepting the chains of a new master because the alternative was death. I surrendered my agency in that moment, gave up the right to choose my own path, became a tool to be used rather than a man to be respected. And so it continued, surrender after surrender, compromise after compromise, until the man who had once been Dmitri Kazan had been eroded away entirely, replaced by something that wore his face and carried his memories, but was no longer capable of the choices that might have redeemed him. This is the true horror of falling to chaos, not the mutations that twist the flesh, not the whispers that corrupt the mind, not even the atrocities that stain the soul beyond any hope of cleansing. It is the slow accumulation of small surrenders, the gradual abandonment of the principles that make us human, the quiet erosion of self that happens so gradually we do not notice until there is nothing left to save. I have watched it happen to others. I have seen men join the warband with fire still in their eyes, with conviction still in their hearts, with the belief that they can somehow serve without becoming what they serve. And I have watched that fire dim, that conviction fade, that belief crumble into ash as the reality of our existence grinds away everything they thought they knew about themselves. Within a year, they are indistinguishable from the rest of us, hollow men going through the motions of life, fighting and killing and surviving, because they have forgotten how to do anything else. The gods find this amusing, I think. The dark powers who rule the warp, who feed on human suffering and grow fat on human despair. They do not need grand corruptions or dramatic falls to claim their due. They are patient. They are subtle. They understand that most souls are not lost in moments of crisis, but in the quiet spaces between, in the small compromises that seem insignificant at the time, in the surrenders so minor that we do not recognize them as surrenders until it is far too late. I wonder sometimes how many others are like me, how many traitor guardsmen across the Eye of Terror lie awake in their bunks, staring at metal ceilings, wondering how they came to be what they are. Millions, perhaps, tens of millions, scattered across warbands and cults in the forgotten corners of a galaxy that has been at war for 10,000 years. We are an army of the damned, united not by faith or conviction, but by the simple absence of alternatives, fighting not for victory, but merely for the continuation of existence. And I wonder if any of them have found what I have been seeking, some meaning, some purpose, some reason to continue beyond the mere mechanics of survival. I wonder if any of them have discovered a truth that makes the horror bearable, that transforms the endless slaughter into something more than pointless violence. I have not found it. I do not believe it exists, but I have found something else, something smaller, something that may be the only comfort available to those who have walked the path I have walked. I have found the understanding that I am not alone, not in the sense of companionship or brotherhood. Those concepts have been burned out of me, along with everything else that once made me human, but in the sense of shared experience, of collective damnation, of knowing that across the galaxy, in every warband and cult and heretic army, others are carrying the same weight I carry, fighting the same battles I fight, losing the same pieces of themselves that I have lost. We are a communion of the damned, we traitor guardsmen. We are the forgotten soldiers of a war that will never end, serving masters who do not care whether we live or die, fighting for causes we do not believe in, against enemies we once called brothers. We are the price the galaxy pays for its eternal conflict, the fuel that feeds the fires of a war that has been burning since before our species existed. And perhaps, there is a kind of meaning in that. Not redemption, not salvation, not the restoration of what has been lost, but the simple acknowledgement that our suffering is shared, that our damnation is not unique, that we are part of something larger than ourselves, even if that something is terrible beyond comprehension. I do not know if this is wisdom or merely the desperate rationalization of a man who has run out of other comforts. I do not know if the thoughts I have shared in this testimony will reach anyone, will matter to anyone, will change anything in a galaxy that has seen horrors far greater than my small story of fall and damnation. But I know this: I was a man once. I believed in something. I served with honor, fought with courage, loved my brothers, and trusted my commanders, and thought that my life had purpose. That man is gone now. He died in increments across 20 years of war, surrendering pieces of himself one by one, until nothing remained but the hollow shell that speaks these words. But he existed. That matters. It has to matter. Because if it does not, if the man I was is truly gone, without trace, without meaning, without any legacy beyond the blood I have spilled, then there is nothing left to cling to, nothing left to hold against the darkness, nothing left at all. My name is Dmitri Kazan. I was a sergeant of the Vostroyan Firstborn. I served the Emperor for 11 years before I betrayed him, and I have served the ruinous powers for 9 years since. This is my testimony. This is my confession. This is the only record that will ever exist of the man I was and the thing I have become. Remember it if you can. Learn from it if you are wise. And if you ever find yourself on the path I walked, if you ever feel the despair that opened the door to my damnation, if you ever contemplate the first surrender that leads to all the others, turn back. Turn back while you still can, while there is still something left to save, while the man you are has not yet been eroded into the monster you will become. There is no redemption on this road. There is no glory at its end. There is only the war, endless and eternal, and the slow dissolution of everything you thought you were. I know. I have walked it, and I am still walking, because I no longer know how to stop. The Emperor forgive me. I know he will not. But the words are all I have left, and I find I cannot stop saying them, even now, even here, even knowing that no one is listening. The Emperor forgive me. The Emperor forgive us all.